Hello, friends. Thanks for joining me in this series on leadership potholes and how to avoid them. Today's lesson is on the unaccountable leader. It also could be called the temptable leader or the vulnerable leader, because if you're not accountable, eventually you could be temptable. You could be vulnerable. So this is a really important topic. Their scandals are ripe this year. I'm taping this in 2024, and the scandals are just popping up all over the place in the church world and the corporate world, all over the place. And it's people that you wouldn't expect necessarily. It's people you thought were great leaders, people that seem to have a lot of gifts, a lot of knowledge. They seem to be smart, but yet they do really dumb things. So how can we avoid this leadership pothole on the highway to where we're supposed to go? Well, there's an old preacher, and it was kind of politically incorrect how he said it, but he said there's three things that'll get a leader in trouble. It's the gold, the gals, and the glory. That's particularly kind of insensitive about the gals, but anyway, you get the point. It's basically money, sex, and power. Money, sex, and power. Those tend to be three of the biggest areas where scandals occur. And I want to talk particularly about the sexual potholes, because that seems to be one of the top ones these days. I had two friends, and they both went a similar journey, and they had different results. One of them I'll call Larry. It's not his real name. He was a longtime Christian. He was a respected elder and a home group leader in his church. But he was secretly addicted to pornography and secretly an alcoholic. And finally his wife discovered his addictions, and it was so bad that she threw him out of the house. He eventually spent time in a mental institution and a halfway house, because he didn't have any other place to go, and the mental institution was trying to help him back to sanity, because he basically became crazy for a while. Well, anyway, but here's the good news. Larry repented. He turned to God. He said, Lord, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for my hidden life, my secret life. And he repented. He got right with God again. He got right with his wife. It took a lot for her to take him back, but she did. And it's still a work in progress. Trust once broken is difficult to restore, but Larry has done the work, and he's paid the price. He got involved in AA and in recovery groups. Now he's actually helping others. And so it's kind of a success story of sorts. He fell. He had problems. He was unaccountable for a while. But now within this AA community, there's a lot of accountability. He's got what they call a sponsor, and the sponsor asks him hard questions all the time, like, Larry, are you staying away from pornography? Are you staying away from alcohol? Are you sober these days? And so it's working. And his wife loves him, and things are much better there. There's another friend, I'll call him Lorenzo, again, not his real name. He had a kind of a similar journey. He was addicted to pornography and some things too. He actually went to some strip clubs, spent a bunch of money there, and but he repented too, just like Larry. But the interesting thing with Lorenzo is his wife would not take him back. She basically said, we're done. I'm going to divorce you. And so in both cases, there were consequences, and sometimes the consequences don't seem fair, but the consequences are real. You probably know the story about how David sinned with Bathsheba, a married woman, and even had her husband killed in battle. That was rough. And so Bathsheba became pregnant. And that was part of the story too. And so David was confronted by the prophet Nathan, and he repented. That's the good part of the story. Psalm 51, you can read about his repentance. He says, Lord, create in me a clean heart, renew a right spirit. He said, against you only have I sinned. And he repented. But in that case, there were consequences. And the baby that Bathsheba was carrying, David's baby, died. Despite David's prayers, beseeching God, fasting, all that, the baby died. So there's consequences, and we can't complain about the consequences because they're real. God's merciful, and a lot of times we avoid consequences we probably should have had. So why do leaders particularly have to deal with this leadership pothole? Now, anybody could get involved in an affair and addictions and things like that. So that's not just leaders that happens to, but leaders have particular vulnerabilities. For one thing, they have more stress than others. And so when you have more stress and you get more depleted emotionally and physically, then you tend to become more vulnerable. In the AA community, the recovery community, they say whenever you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you need to halt, 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 because you're vulnerable, and leaders become vulnerable because they're stressed out. They're vulnerable, they're tired, they're emotionally drained. And sometimes they neglect their health. They sometimes neglect their marriage. They're out saving the world, creating inventions, doing this, doing that, doing ministry, whatever. And they're not taking care of their own garden, so to speak. They're not taking care of their own marriage, their own family. And so they become vulnerable specifically. Another thing about leaders is leaders are very conscious about their image. They want to keep their reputation. They want to look good in the community. They want to impress everybody with their image. Well, that makes it difficult for them to be accountable, for them to be honest, for them to confess, for them to share about their struggles. Frankly, that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, even with ministers and pastors, is that it's fine to share about your victories and all the success stories and all the testimonies, but sometimes you got to share about the struggles. Paul in 2 Corinthians shared about his struggles, all the difficulties that he faced. And so leaders sometimes have a hard time with that, though. They want to look good. They want to be God's man of faith and power, God's woman of faith and power. But sometimes they forget you got to be honest. You got to be real. And so that accountability is difficult. Also, people, particularly these days, have a lot of unstructured and unsupervised time. It used to be people had time clocks and, they got in at 8, left at 5, everybody kind of knew where they were. Well, now it's harder, and particularly if you're in leadership or you're in ministry, you go off and people don't really know where you're at or what you're doing, and so it's a lot easier to think that you can get away with things. Well, anyway, wow, it's a tough thing. And here's another part of that's really difficult. A lot of times leaders have a hard time finding accountability partners. Why is that? Because if you're the boss of the organization, think about it, you're the boss. Who's going to hold you accountable? You can hold other people accountable, the vice presidents, the managers, the employees, whatever. But who's going to hold the CEO, the boss, accountable? Likewise, who's going to hold the pastor accountable? I firmly believe that every pastor, every leader of a church ought to have somebody, maybe not in their congregation necessarily, but some other leader that can hold them accountable, can ask them the hard questions. How are you doing in your life? How's your thought life? How's your marriage? How's your stress level? Is there something we should talk about? So that's important, but it's difficult. It's difficult for leaders, for pastors, for CEOs, for the boss. So even if we're the boss, even if we're the pastor, even if we're the leader of the organization, we should do our best to put some guardrails in there. But it's a big problem. One of the things I've noticed over the years is people are only as accountable as they want to be. So you can try to put all kind of fancy guardrails and rules and regulations and stuff, but in the end, it's really tough if people want to evade the accountability. The Bible talks a lot about this kind of stuff. King Saul had a prophet, Samuel, to hold him responsible. That's a great thing, huh? But even then, he didn't agree with Samuel, and he tried to excuse himself. He rationalized his disobedience, and he resisted Samuel's wise input and counsel. So he had some accountability in theory, but in practice, he really didn't. King David was blessed to have a great friend named Jonathan. And while Jonathan was still alive, David had a lot of battles, a lot of challenges, but he didn't have any great moral failures. But Jonathan died, and a couple years later is this situation with Bathsheba, and Nathan the prophet finally confronts him. So in a sense, David had accountability in this Nathan came and confronted him. But in the meantime, David had sinned, and sinned in a really big, terrible way. Well, a lot of other examples in the Bible. People that should have been accountable, and they really weren't. I recently have been restudying about John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. And in his movement, he created not just revivals and preaching and evangelism, but he had small groups, and that was really important. And the small groups were a place of accountability, and they would meet weekly, and they would ask some really tough questions. How about this? Here's some of the questions that would be in his small groups. What known sins have you committed since our last meeting? Can you imagine that? Going around the circle, hey, John, what sins have you sinned since we met last week? You know, hey, Susie, what sins have you committed since our last meeting? The next one was, what temptations have you met with, and how were you delivered? In other words, hey, even if you didn't sin, tell us about your temptations. Whoa. And then the next one is, what have you thought, said, or done of which you doubt whether it be sin or not? So in other words, if you're not really sure about something, whether it was sin or not, just tell us about that as well. And then the last one is a crazy one too. It says, do you have anything you've desired to keep secret? So in other words, if there's something you want to hide, something you want to keep secret, tell us about that too. Well, the interesting thing is John Wesley had, he had several hundred people that were part of these meetings, but it wasn't as easy as he thought. A lot of people, after the first week, they thought, I don't think I want to go around the circle and share my dirty laundry again. Well, some of those questions might seem a little bit extreme, but here's a question I have for you. Do you have anybody in your life, a friend, a mentor, a pastor, who can ask you personal questions like this? See, in the AA recovery movement, they're asking people those questions all the time because they realize they need accountability. They've fallen deeply and become addicted and just about lost their life, their marriage, and all kinds of things. And so they realize, I need an accountability person. But a lot of times, we don't really want that level of accountability. We don't think that we need that level of accountability. But the AA recovery group kind of people, they realize, wow, if I don't have some accountability, I'm liable to relapse. But one problem that leaders tend to have is they're confident about their own ability, and often they feel kind of invincible. They feel like I can handle it myself. Even if I am tempted, I'll deal with it myself. I don't need anybody. I don't want to share with somebody else. That'll make me look weak. Well, yeah, you are weak. You know, we all are weak, and we have to be careful about this thing. So here's something to remember. If you are an unaccountable leader, you're also a temptable leader. You're also a vulnerable leader, because without accountability, we're all temptable and we're all vulnerable. That's hard to believe. I mean, I'm a pretty good guy, you know, but hey, I'm temptable under certain circumstances, particularly if there's no accountability. Comedian W.C. Fields said, he was a comedian in the last century, he said, I've never seen a temptation I didn't like. You see, that's the problem with temptation. It's a temptation because it's something that we like. It's something that we're attracted to. And that's what makes it so tough, so dangerous. Back when I was a pastor in Ohio, I created a thing called the Life Outline, L-I-F-E. And so when we had elders meetings, we would go around the circle, and it was a little bit like John Wesley's thing, but a little bit lower level than that. And it was, how are you doing with the Lord? That's L. Individual needs, that's I. Individual needs, temptations, and prayer requests. You know, what can we pray for you about? And F is family, because if your family's not doing well, if your marriage isn't doing well, your kids aren't doing well, then that's a pretty important thing. And eventually that's going to really drag you down if you don't deal with it and get some prayer and get some help. And E is expectancy. Boy, That was really an important one. Expectancy means, what are you looking at for the future? Do you have a positive outlook about your life, about your ministry, about your job, your career, whatever? Do you have a positive outlook, or are you down and you think, oh my gosh, it's hopeless, it's worthless, we're not doing any good? And one of the things about all these accountability questions are, the goal is to catch sin in its earliest phases. Think about that. You don't want to, I went through cancer and chemo back in 2019, and the goal is to find it before it gets very far. Isn't that important? And so I just got a new whiteboard from Amazon, so I'm so excited about it. I got to draw you a picture here. This is called The Roots and the Fruits. So here's the soil line right here, okay? And so every tree, every plant, everything, oops, I'm a terrible drawer. I don't know why I do this all the time. So every tree, every plant has its branches, but it also has the roots. And if the roots are not doing well, well, then the fruits are going to do bad too. So ideally, you have some fruit out here. And you have some apples, some oranges, bananas, whatever you have, you have some fruit. But if your roots are bad, eventually you're going to have bad fruit. And I think leaders really need to see that. It's not just how you look today, it's how are your roots? What's going on beneath the surface? What's going on in the area that we can't see? And the Bible talks so much about that kind of stuff. It says, from out of the heart comes good things and bad things. Guard your heart with all diligence, because out of your heart comes the issues of life. So the hidden things, the things of the heart, that's where it all is. One of the things here's another prop I love to use. I might have done this in some of my other videos with you, is a compass. And the interesting thing about a compass is, if you are just a few degrees off in your trajectory, it might not show up today. You might still seem okay. Maybe a week later, you're a little off. Maybe a month later, you're a lot more off. And so it's important in the early stages to realize, am I lined up with God? Am I lined up with His Word? Am I doing the things I'm supposed to be doing? Is my marriage the way it should be? And if not, if you're even off a few degrees in the trajectory, it will eventually become way far off. It's important to realize that. Well, what are some practical things? Billy Graham, back in 1948, when one of his first crusades was in Modesto, California, and he said, even back then there were a lot of scandals among evangelists and preachers. And he said, how can we avoid this? How can we keep accountability, not only to keep from sinning, but also to keep from looking like we're sinning, keep the appearance of evil? How do we avoid that? And he created some sort of rules, and some other pastors have refined those things. And here's some of the ideas. Don't visit the opposite sex alone at home. That's dangerous. Don't counsel the opposite sex alone in your office. In other words, you should keep the door open, or, don't close the door and be in there counseling the person with the opposite sex. You shall not counsel the opposite sex more than once without their mate being present. In other words, you don't want to get real close, a heart tie, a soul tie with this other person as they're sharing all their issues. Next, you should not go to breakfast or lunch alone with the opposite sex. Whoa, that's kind of heavy there. You should not show affection in any way that could be considered improper. Yeah, public displays of affection. We do a lot of hugging in the church, at least our church we do. And wow, we got to be careful about that. I was in a church once in Florida, and man, they hugged in inappropriate ways, let's just say, and eventually it caught up with them. Turned out a lot of scandals there. You shall not discuss detailed sexual problems with the opposite sex in counseling situations. In other words, tell me more. Tell me how it's going with your husband. You got to be careful about that. And you should also not discuss your own marriage problems with someone of the opposite sex. That's a sure way to open a door for wrong stuff. You have to be careful about answering cards, letters, or emails from the opposite sex. A lot of these scandals, what ends up happening is maybe the pastor, the leader, the CEO, he denies it all, but then the other person says, here's a text message, here's an email, look, I got the proof right here. We got to be careful about our communications and not leading people on, not having things that can be taken inappropriately. And basically we need a whole culture in our organization, our staff, our church, whoever we're leading, so that we're looking out for each other and trying to promote sexual purity and also integrity and financial and other kinds of things. Well, here's a question for you. Is the list I just read to you, is it too strict? See, there was a vice president under first term of President Trump, Mike Pence. You might remember him. And he was a Christian man, a godly man, and he tried to implement these kind of things. He said, I'm not going to meet with any woman alone in my office. I'm not going to drive in my car alone with a woman I'm not married to. And guess what happened? The news media ridiculed him. They thought he was strange and crazy and way too strict and way too religious. Why do you do such things? Well, here's the reality. Would you rather be a little too strict and have preventative things like that, or would you rather have a scandal? Well, anyway, the secular media is not real bright on that sort of thing, because it's better to be safe than sorry. It's better to stay away from the edge than to see how close you can get. There's an old story about a stagecoach driver, and he was just a young man, and he was with a bunch of other stagecoach drivers, and they were talking about their last run, and the one said, oh man, we were going 30 miles an hour on these mountain passage, and we were going zipping around and everything, and just came within an inch of going off the cliff. Another one said, that's nothing. He said, my wheel actually went off the edge, and then I had to pull it back. Oh my gosh, it's such a thrilling thing. And this young man who was a stagecoach driver said, whoa, guys, I might be in the wrong place, because I thought it was your goal to stay as far away from destruction as you could instead of see how close you could get. You see, that's an important thing. And I just want to remind you that, momentary pleasure, momentary indiscretion can lead to permanent damage to your reputation, to your marriage. Just a moment of fun, a moment of DUI, a moment of giving into your passions. Moses, it says, bypassed the passing pleasures of sin because he was looking for something better. That should be the way we are too. Well, as we get ready to wind down, I'm going to share a really important story about Joseph in the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 39. You might remember the story. Joseph had a bunch of dreams. His brothers put him in a well, and he gets sold into slavery. He ends up to be a servant to Potiphar, one of the Egyptian officials. And Potiphar's wife, it says, day after day, said to Joseph, this young, handsome man, sleep with me, sleep with me, sleep with me. And here's Joseph, he's single. There's no one else around. He could probably get away with it. Potiphar's wife was attractive. And there's some of the three most powerful words in any story in the Bible. It says, but he refused. Say that with me. But he refused. He refused. So he had every opportunity to do it. He had every chance he probably thought he could get away with it. Here, this woman is throwing herself at him, but he refused. Well, I hope that you have that heart too, to refuse. And Joseph says something kind of amazing. He says, how could I do such great evil? Well, the interesting thing, the 10 Commandments hadn't been written yet. The law of Moses hadn't even come about yet, but he just sensed somehow that it was a wrong thing to sleep with another man's wife. Wow. So the roots and the fruits. Here's something someone shared with me a long time ago. If you sow a thought, you'll reap an action. If you sow an action, you'll eventually reap a habit. If you sow a habit, you'll eventually reap a lifestyle. If you sow a lifestyle, it'll eventually become a stronghold. And if you sow a stronghold, you will reap a destiny. But you see, it all started with a thought. Isn't that something? It all started with a thought, and we don't think our thoughts are very important, but it starts there. Jesus said, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Basically what he's saying is, deal with sin right away. Deal with it ruthlessly right away. Don't let it get out of hand. Don't let it get down to the stage where it's become a destiny. Wow. So, where do we go from here? Perhaps you're already compromised in some way. Perhaps you've already gone too far. You've gotten into a relationship you shouldn't got into. You've got into an addiction you shouldn't get into. And what do you do then? Sometimes it seems impossible, seems hopeless. People, they just say, I quit. I'm going to jump off a bridge or something. But here's what I want to really say to you. Yeah, it's hard clawing back when you have done things that are wrong, morally wrong, financially wrong, whatever. It's tough. It's really tough. You have to make hard decisions, hard choices to get back. But here's what I want to say to you. There's hope. There is hope. James chapter 5, verse 16 says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. God wants to heal you, but it starts with confession, with honesty. Proverbs 28:13, whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. So if you try to cover it up, like Adam and Eve, remember that story? And they covered it up with fig leaves, and they tried to minimize, tried to excuse, tried to do all this stuff. You're not going to prosper. Things are not going to go your way. And sometimes I'm from more of a Protestant background, a non-denominational background. So sometimes we kind of laugh at the Catholic Church. They have a priest and a confession booth, and people come in and say, Father, I've sinned, blah, blah, blah. And we think that's kind of funny. Well, look, that's not how I would say is the best way to do it, but hey, at least there's a place where they can confess. And I think we all need a confessor. We all need people in our lives that we can tell the truth to. You probably remember the story of the prodigal son. He got in the pig pen, feeding the pigs, ran out of money because he had wild living, and things are hopeless and stuff, but he came back to his father. And I want to encourage you today, you can come back. You can come back to your father. Hopefully you can come back to your wife or your husband, your kids. You can come back. There's hope to come back. Well, I want to encourage you also, feel free to contact me. On the final slide, you'll see my contact information. I can't say that I can help you necessarily, but I'll point you to some resources that can help you. I'll point you to some friends of mine who are skilled in dealing with addictions and dealing with sexual problems and things like that. So look at the contact information. Feel free to give me some feedback on this whole thing. And there is hope. There is recovery available for you. God bless you today. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.